long before anyone talked about vitamins, before pharmacies and pills and little warning labels on plastic bottles. There was gold, not just on your ring finger, not just pressed into a king's seal or resting atop a crown, but in your cup, and sometimes in your veins. If you had enough wealth to own gold in the 1600s, you were already powerful. But if you drank it, you were something else entirely. You were refined. You were divine. You weren't just wearing status. You were swallowing it. They didn't call it liquid gold for nothing. We like to think the past was a place of muddy boots and cabbage soup. But among the aristocrats, in velvet coats and powdered wigs, the body was a delicate, glittering thing. And it had to be treated like treasure. You had to balance it, calm it, nourish it. And if something went wrong, a rash, a bad dream, a pain behind the eyes, you didn't look to the heavens. You looked to metal. Because gold, they said, was perfect. It didn't rust. It didn't spoil. It shimmered in sunlight and refused to tarnish. To ancient alchemists and Renaissance physicians alike, that wasn't just chemistry. That was proof of something divine. And what was more divine than eternal life? If gold could survive centuries underground without a blemish, then perhaps, just perhaps, it could do the same inside the body. They believed that gold, in the right form, could purify your blood, clear your mind, and extend your years. It didn't matter how ridiculous it seemed, because once you made it to the top of the social ladder, the only thing left to chase was time. In grand halls and candlelit bedrooms, men and women sipped gold like medicine. Some drank it in wine. Others dissolved it in vinegar. A few took it as powder mixed into bread or rubbed into the gums. It was called potable, drinkable gold. Not many people questioned it, because gold was expensive. And expensive things, of course, were always good for you. Kings drank it. Queens dabbed it on their faces. Doctors swore by it. And somewhere, in a forgotten little apothecary, a tired apprentice ground down gold coins for the next glittering remedy, while wondering if anyone actually got better. Some didn't. In fact, some died from it. But death wasn't always a deterrent, because the dream of immortality sparkled louder than logic. And as long as gold shimmered in the glass, someone, somewhere, would drink it down. They weren't mad. At least, not in the way we'd like to believe. They were just human. Terrified of illness, of aging, of fading beauty and fading breath. And gold, warm, glowing, eternal, seemed to promise all the things they were afraid to lose. That was enough. More than enough. So yes, once upon a time, the richest people in Europe didn't just decorate themselves with gold. They swallowed it. Because when you had everything else, only one thing was left to conquer. Time. Before doctors had stethoscopes. Before hospitals had electricity. There were alchemists. They didn't wear white coats. They wore soot-covered robes, smelled like herbs and smoke, and worked in rooms full of bubbling glass and flickering candlelight. They whispered in Latin. They mapped the stars. And they believed that metals could change. Not just in the earth, but inside the body. Gold, to them, wasn't just valuable. It was sacred. A metal touched by the sun. In the alchemist's world, everything had a secret. Salt was the body. Mercury was the spirit. Sulfur was the soul. And gold. Gold was perfection. But alchemists didn't just want to turn lead into gold. That was only part of the promise. What they really wanted, what they dreamed of, was to turn the human body into something just as flawless. They believed that gold had the power to heal the sick, reverse decay, and maybe even unlock immortality. Deep in castles and cellars, they stirred crushed rubies into wine, distilled smoke from rose petals, and simmered thin shavings of gold in strange elixirs. They didn't call them medicines. They called them tinctures, waters of life, essences. They glowed. They shimmered. And sometimes, they hissed. The goal wasn't just to make something shiny. It was to find the elixir of life, the thing that could keep a king alive forever, or cure a dying queen, or grant a philosopher the clarity of the angels. One of the most famous alchemists, Paracelsus, believed that gold, when properly purified, could act like sunlight in the body. He wrote that gold was incorruptible, and that if it was refined into a drinkable form, it could drive out disease with its brilliance. And what ruler didn't want that? Paracelsus died young, but his ideas lived on for centuries. By the 1500s, the promise of gold was no longer just theory. It had become therapy, and not for the common man. Only the rich could afford to drink gold, and only the desperate would pay whatever it cost. Wealthy nobles began commissioning private alchemists, building secret laboratories in castle basements, and surrounding themselves with potions that sparkled like treasure. It didn't matter if it worked. It mattered that it was golden. And so, in the candlelit corners of Europe, powdered gold was poured into goblets and whispered over like holy water. It was no longer just a symbol of wealth. It had become a symbol of hope. But there was always a catch. To turn solid gold into something drinkable, you had to dissolve it, and gold doesn't dissolve easily. So alchemists turned to harsh chemicals. Mercury, aqua regia, acids that burned skin and ate through metal. The same mixtures that stripped paint from walls were used to make potions for aching bones. And the people who drank them didn't always wake up. Still, no one wanted to admit it. No one wanted to believe that the very thing they cherished, the substance of kings and gods, could also poison them. So they kept drinking. Because alchemy wasn't just about science. It was about faith. Faith that the body could become golden. Faith that the soul could be preserved in something that never rusted. And faith, after all, has always been more powerful than truth. By the early 1700s, gold had moved beyond the pages of alchemy books. It now appeared in high society's teacups, tonic bottles, and dinner tables, not as an ornament, but as an ingredient. In Vienna, it was whispered that Empress Maria Theresa herself kept a vial of drinkable gold near her bedside. A few drops stirred into warm wine before sleep were said to strengthen the heart and quiet anxious thoughts. In England, powdered gold was sold in apothecaries under names like aurum potable or potable gold, usually steeped in alcohol or rosewater and marketed as a life-extending elixir. And while most commoners couldn't dream of affording such indulgences, the aristocracy embraced it with astonishing devotion. Some nobles added gold leaf to their morning milk. Others mixed it into their medicines, convinced it could heal melancholy, strengthen the brain, or even rekindle lost passions. Behind these glittering rituals was the old idea that gold, because it never rusted, never corroded, and never aged, must somehow share those same powers with the body. If you could swallow a substance that defied time, perhaps you too could live untouched by age. A French noblewoman named Madame de la Lande was rumored to spend over 1,000 livres a year on gold-infused water, taken every morning with a piece of sugared orange peel. She claimed it cured her fainting spells. Her letters even suggest she believed it had kept the bitterness of widowhood at bay. But gold wasn't just consumed, it was also injected. In 1715, a curious London surgeon named Thomas Grenell experimented with gold suspensions, blending flecks of the metal into a viscous serum that he used to treat arthritis. The results? Dubious. The patients? Mostly rich and hopeful. At court gatherings, sipping gold-laced wine became a fashion statement, not just a health choice. It was a way to show one's wealth, refinement, and belief in the cutting edge of medicine, even if that edge was lined in flakes of metal. But for every aristocrat sipping their shimmering remedies in silk robes, there was always a doctor warning against it. Some physicians claimed too much gold could damage the kidneys, cloud the mind, or worse, poison the blood. Yet those warnings rarely made it past the marble halls of wealth. After all, if gold was good enough for kings and queens, who was a common apothecary to argue? And still, behind all this glowing glamour, a darker truth remained. Most of these potions did absolutely nothing. Except, perhaps, lighten the purse. Of course, it wasn't long before the shimmering dream of drinking gold started to show its cracks. While a gold-laced cordial might have looked impressive on a polished tray, its effects on the body were questionable at best and alarming at worst. In 1742, a wealthy banker in Amsterdam named Cornelius van Heemskerk collapsed during a dinner party after consuming his nightly elixir of longevity. It contained a mixture of saffron, cinnamon, powdered emerald, and half a gram of gold leaf. His personal physician noted in a letter that Van Heemskerk's urine had turned a peculiar greenish hue, and he suffered tremors for days afterward. Was it the gold? Possibly. Was it the emeralds? Very likely. But the incident didn't stop his widow from continuing to order the same elixir. She simply reduced the dose. Physicians at the time had no way to precisely measure trace metals in the body. Instead, they relied on anecdote and guesswork. If a patient improved after taking gold, the potion was praised. If they declined, the doctor simply claimed the dose had been too small, or perhaps the stars were misaligned that day. And so the rituals continued. In Paris, a perfumer named Claude Rameau began selling a gold-infused tonic that he claimed could restore youth from the tip of your tongue to the ends of your eyelashes. His advertisements featured testimonials from countesses and dukes, many of whom had received complimentary bottles. He sold thousands of vials in the spring of 1755 alone. Unfortunately, the mixture contained not only edible gold, but turpentine and crushed mothballs, meant to stimulate the blood. Several customers reported sudden nausea and confusion. One noblewoman collapsed at the opera, clutching her throat and declaring she had seen Saint Joan winking at her from the chandelier. The authorities briefly investigated, but Rameau was never punished. He simply changed the label, removed the turpentine, and renamed the tonic the Angel's Bloom. It sold even faster. Gold, by this point, had become something more than a metal. It was an idea, untouchable, incorruptible, mystical. And if drinking it came with a few side effects, that was considered the cost of brilliance. By the late 18th century, even some doctors had started to believe that gold had spiritual qualities. One wrote that gold purifies the inner fire of man, while another insisted that it could chase away the vapors of madness. There were also whispers, more superstition than science, that drinking gold could make one more attractive, more magnetic. A Parisian poet once claimed that his mistress looked more luminous after a week of taking a golden cordial. Her skin glowed, her lips deepened in hue, and her eyes took on a spark of divinity. But then again, love can be just as blinding as gold. By the 1860s, America was catching up fast. The rise of patent medicines brought gold into the hands and stomachs of anyone who could afford the shimmering cure. One advertisement from the time promised that Dr. Harmon's gold elixir could restore youth to the elderly, sharpen the wits of the dim, and, perhaps most intriguingly, revive the male powers with virility unknown since Roman days. The truth, as usual, was more complicated. These elixirs were often brewed in basements and sold from the backs of wagons, with gold dust occasionally added by the thinnest pinch, just enough to sparkle under a lamp. But even a small amount of real gold made these tinctures vastly more expensive, which in turn made them more desirable to the rich. After all, if something costs a fortune, it must be good for you. Physicians of the time didn't necessarily approve. While some high society doctors played along, especially those who catered to wealthy clients with more curiosity than sense, many warned that ingesting gold could be dangerous. Gold wasn't poisonous, exactly, but it wasn't digestible either. It simply passed through the body unchanged, gleaming faintly in chamber pots across Manhattan and Boston. Still, the idea of golden medicine persisted. The aura of ancient wisdom combined with modern marketing created a powerful cocktail of hope. And hope, for the desperate or vain, was worth any price. By 1875, a peculiar new trend emerged: gold injections. Wealthy patients, especially women in European spas, began to receive small intramuscular doses of colloidal gold, often marketed as a way to combat nervous conditions or improve the complexion of the soul. These treatments, although largely ineffective, were often followed by elaborate spa routines, including gold leaf facials and steam baths scented with saffron and rose. In one famous case, Countess Adelina von Rudenheim reportedly underwent 6 weeks of gold injections to recover from a broken heart. She returned to Vienna claiming she had not only healed emotionally, but that her eyesight had improved and her hair had darkened naturally. Of course, there was no proof, but salons and newspapers lapped it up. By the 1770s, the obsession with gold-based elixirs had evolved into a full-blown market frenzy. Not just doctors or alchemists, but quacks, fortune seekers, and aging noblemen were all cashing in. Bottles of gold-infused water were auctioned in London drawing rooms. Some had actual gold dust floating in the liquid, visible to the naked eye. Others were just colored and priced to suggest it. And the prices were outrageous. A single ounce of the aurum potable elixir, marketed as the purest, alchemically active gold solution, could cost more than a laborious monthly wage. Of course, It helped if your name came with a few titles. Ladies of leisure would clutch bottles shaped like perfume flasks, tipping them delicately on the tongue before fainting into embroidered chaise lounges. One woman reportedly sold her husband's pocket watch collection to buy a full set of royal gold drops, which promised to purify the blood and restore youthful bloom. She drank them daily and insisted her complexion had changed from dull wax to Dresden porcelain. Whether the gold worked, or whether she simply stopped eating anything else, remains unclear. Physicians, meanwhile, faced a dilemma. The medical community was starting to fracture. While some still embraced the ancient lore of metallic cures, others leaned into the new science of empiricism. They called gold a nonsense cure, a vanity for the desperate, as one Edinburgh doctor put it. But there were patients with deep pockets who demanded gold. So many physicians obliged, quietly. And not just in Europe. In colonial America, gold elixirs found their strange reception. While frontier medicine still relied on roots, leeches, and prayer, the elite of cities like Boston and Philadelphia wanted whatever the European gentry had. If Parisian society sipped gold water, so would they. Benjamin Franklin himself, though more inclined toward electricity than alchemy, once wrote of a curious lady of Virginia who claimed to treat melancholia with gold syrup. She served it in silver spoons, surrounded by fine lace and African servants, convinced it kept her from slipping into madness. Patent medicine makers pounced on this new fashion. By 1790, American newspapers ran ads for American Aurum and Dr. Klein's Golden Life Elixir, claiming to cure ailments as diverse as heart palpitations, hysteria, baldness, and fainting spells. Some bottles were filled with tinctures of saffron and orange blossom, mimicking the golden hue. Others did contain real gold leaf, hammered into delicate flakes. Doctors warned of organ damage, but sellers said the flakes would mingle with the vital spirit. It was even rumored that one southern plantation owner had his enslaved workers drink trace amounts of gold during smallpox outbreaks, believing it might ward off disease. The results were never documented, but his wealth ensured no one questioned him directly. By the early 1800s, reports of gold poisoning began trickling into medical journals. Victims complained of swollen tongues, blackened gums, and an eerie metallic taste that lingered for days. Some experienced tremors. Others became unusually forgetful, or paranoid, or fainted in social settings, always clutching their gold vials as they collapsed. In 1822, a French chemist named Lucien Lavoisier attempted a controlled experiment. He gave a group of volunteers small doses of drinkable gold, charting their symptoms. Most fell ill within a week. One developed kidney failure. Another began hallucinating voices instructing him to drink deeper. The study was quietly buried. Still, the allure refused to die. Gold, after all, was more than a metal. It was a symbol of purity, of divinity, of eternal youth. A Viennese countess in her 60s became famous for bathing in gold-infused milk every Sunday. A Prussian prince kept a physician on retainer just to monitor his gold therapy. And in London, a secretive society of wealthy eccentrics met monthly to test new auric infusions. They called themselves the Guild of the Gilded Gut. Behind the velvet curtains of wealth, a quiet desperation pulsed. What if gold really did keep death away? By the mid-1800s, America had developed a peculiar appetite, not just for expansion or industry, but for remedies that sparkled. Quite literally, actually. As medical trends from Europe crossed the Atlantic, gold-based cures were eagerly embraced by wealthy American families hoping to stay ahead of death and each other. Gold was no longer just for rings or railroads. Now, it was being marketed as a cure for everything from melancholy to alcoholism, insomnia, and even general decline of the faculties. If you were tired, anxious, aging, or simply not living your fullest upper-class life, gold might just fix you. Or so they said. One of the most famous gold-based treatments came courtesy of a man named Dr. Leslie E. Keeley, who founded the Keeley Institute in Illinois. His big idea: that gold chloride injections could cure alcoholism. It was called the Keeley Cure, and by the 1890s, it had spread to over 200 branches across the U.S., Canada, and Europe. The promise was extraordinary: no judgment, no suffering, just a discreet series of injections and a comfortable stay at the institute. You could check in an alcoholic and check out a gentleman, all with the help of a little liquid gold. The precise ingredients of Keely's famous injections were kept secret, of course, but people swore by them. Some even claimed their husbands came back gentler, quieter, more manageable. Wealthy families paid handsomely for the treatment, sometimes sending wayward sons or unfaithful husbands under the guise of a health retreat. Others went themselves, hoping to cleanse body and soul with a gilded needle. The allure wasn't just the cure, it was the prestige. The very fact that gold was involved made it seem more trustworthy, more noble. In advertisements, the Keely cure was framed as a scientific triumph of the age. Testimonials poured in from mayors, judges, ministers, even newspaper editors. There were photos of smiling men holding certificates of cure, as if they had just graduated from a particularly posh college. Some even got lapel pins to prove their recovery, proudly worn at dinner parties like medals of moral victory. Of course, the cure wasn't always permanent. Many quietly relapsed. But the Keely Institute understood something vital. Rich people loved rituals. And what could be more ritualistic than being injected with gold in a serene country manner while sipping mineral water on a wraparound porch? Other forms of gold therapy soon followed. Aurum potable, or drinkable gold, made a curious return, now bottled in fanciful apothecary jars and advertised in elegant typefaces. Some preparations claimed to cure not only nerves but also hysteria, torpor, debility, and even lack of ambition. In one Boston shop, you could buy a gold tincture that claimed to invigorate the moral faculties. What that meant precisely was unclear, but Victorian buyers didn't ask too many questions. If it shimmered and came with a Latin label, it was probably worth it. Among New York's elite, gold elixirs became a quiet trend, offered discreetly during salon evenings or after an unsettling séance. One hostess, according to the Brooklyn Eagle, even kept a golden tonic in a decanter marked confidence. She offered it only to guests who seemed fragile or fashionable. Doctors, for their part, were split. Some declared gold therapy to be the future of nerve medicine, while others dismissed it as a glittery placebo. But by then, it didn't matter. The idea had already taken root, that gold could purify the inside as well as it adorned the outside. One traveling salesman sold gold-plated tongue scrapers that, when used with his special aurum powder, were said to restore the appetite of poets and philosophers. Another peddled gold-dusted lozenges for public speakers who had lost their nerve. Did they work? Probably not. But they sparkled beautifully under gaslight. And yet, for all the silliness and snake oil, they were genuine believers. Some patients wrote impassioned letters to newspapers claiming gold had saved them from despair, from addiction, from the cruel boredom of life without sparkle. Others called it a hoax, a trick played on the vain and the wealthy. Still, America was a country built on hope, and often, illusion. Gold therapy fit perfectly into a society that believed anything was possible, so long as you could pay for it. And in a strange way, that belief was its own kind of medicine. The Keely Institute eventually fell out of fashion, like all fads do. But in its heyday, it represented something deeply human. The desire to be fixed without shame, to be renewed without confession. And if that took a few shimmering injections and a stay in a mansion, so be it. The patients returned to their lives, sometimes better, sometimes not, but always with the memory of something golden flowing in their veins. By the early 20th century, the age of drinking gold was fading. The promises of alchemists, aristocrats, and flamboyant patent medicine makers were slowly revealed as what they truly were: dazzling illusions, glittering but hollow. The wealthy had spent fortunes chasing immortality, rejuvenation, and health, only to realize that gold, for all its brilliance, could not stave off time. Some had experienced mild improvements, likely from the placebo effect, or the attention and care that accompanied such treatments. Others had suffered kidney damage, nausea, or worse. And yet, the allure of gold lingered in culture, in advertisements, and in the collective imagination. It was easy to see why. Gold had always symbolized perfection, untarnished, eternal. In a world filled with illness, loss, and uncertainty, it seemed almost poetic to believe that such perfection could be consumed, absorbed, or injected. And for centuries, people had believed it could. They had dared to swallow the sun itself in pursuit of health, beauty, and longevity. But the story of liquid gold is not just about folly. It's about desire. about humanity's endless hope that life can be paused, that age can be softened, that the body can be perfected. And perhaps, in that shimmering hope, there was something beautiful, even if entirely untrue. Some doctors turned to modern chemistry, writing detailed studies on the risks of metallic therapies. New pharmaceuticals replaced alchemical concoctions. Gold was no longer medicine. It became jewelry, currency, and later, a symbol of wealth and prestige, untouched by the promise of health. Yet, even as people abandoned the practice, the stories persisted. Letters, diaries, and advertisements whispered of empresses drinking golden tonics before bedtime, of men and women paying a fortune for a glimmer of youth, of smallpox patients and fainting nobles clinging to golden hope. History remembered them, not always kindly, but always curiously. And perhaps that is the lesson. The richest people, for all their power and wealth, were still human, still afraid, still searching. They sought eternity in a cup, confidence in a vial, and comfort in the shimmer of a precious metal. They believed that gold could heal, because they believed in the magic of hope itself. So, when you glance at a gold coin, a necklace, or a gilded trophy today, remember, once upon a time, people believed that swallowing a little of it could cure what medicine could not. They drank, they shimmered, they hoped. And whether it worked or not, they lived for the dream, sparkling, foolish, and human to the very end. And perhaps, in the quietest hours, that is all we ever hope for, a little magic, a little comfort, and the belief that something shining might make life a little less fleeting.